Thank you very much. I'm moderating this evening. I don't know if that was completely clear, but it's the easy job. These guys have the hard job, but they're also the experts on China. But I want to start by just a quick opening remark, which is that this is clearly a pretty transformational time in thinking about the United States and China. I mean, I think that if you wanted to ask today which political system was more in need of structural reform, the United States or China, it's not completely clear, right? There's at least an argument. And 2 years ago, you'd have to be Chomsky to make that argument. Right? Now there's an open question. And now I'm the political scientist. Paul and Anne have been focusing much more on the business environment and the economy. But still, you know, maybe to start, the fact is that the United States is littered with experts over the last 20 years who have said that China's about to fall apart. They've really been wrong. And before we go forward-looking, before we even go today, why don't we start with one question going backward-looking, which is, why have they been so wrong? I'll start with that.
I would say that one reason, and there are always many reasons, right, for any issue, but I think a lot of so-called China experts in the States have analyze China from a Western perspective. And this is understandable because we always bring our own biases when looking at something. And so we would naturally say, oh, you know, this is not conforming to what we know, and therefore conclude that something's going to go wrong. So I think a lot of China experts assume that since China's operating in a global financial world that is Western-led, that if China's following all these rules, then you know, they have to follow also certain conclusions if certain rules are violated. And that's why they probably thought that, you know, as China accumulated more debt, China, you know, would find that unsustainable. What I try to explain in my book is that economics is not physics, it's not a hard science, it's a social science. And so with that, it means people can change the rules. And I think that if we look at China's economy more like, you know, a person, yes, someone can have a very set personality, but maybe over time, things change and they, you know, learn to adapt to new environments. And I think that's what, you know, a lot of analysts probably missed. They, you know, looked at economics probably more as a hard and fast thing, thinking that there are certain hard and fast rules that would happen, when in fact that's not true. And so, so I think that it's probably human bias that gets in the way when people try to analyze China. And we have to remember that, you know, we have to be cognizant that maybe the hypothesis is wrong and that there are other reasons that we might not have considered. And so I think that is part of the problem.
Paul?
Yes, I would agree with Anne very strongly that the using metrics of our economy in China don't work very well because the political system is radically different. So China is not a capitalist country. It uses capitalist methods, but it doesn't run its country, its whole country and its economy on a capitalist basis, using markets to a great degree. So all the talk about risks have to be caveated on that. On top of this issue of getting it wrong in the downward angle, the disaster mongers, if you like, I would also say that over the years there's been also a great deal of euphoria about China. when Deng Xiaoping famously put on a Texan hat. A lot of unjustified desire to make China like us one day in the future. And if you listen to the China experts in the United States today, and Ray on the Hill or anybody else, what we're hearing is that all of a sudden China is not what we thought it would be. And I've always tried to separate out my own personal views, and I've taken strong views on things that are happening in China, but also allow China to do what it needs to do and to fulfill its own aspirations. And I think that the foreign observers have consistently gone in one extreme or another. And actually, today China is actually, if you like, coming out of the closet and saying more clearly what it wants to be. For a long time, I think China was like outwardly very soft and internally saying what it wanted to do. I think the gloves have come off. I think China is a much more mature and assertive country now. And I think that everything that's happening today was actually mooted by Deng Xiaoping, was suggested by Deng Xiaoping. They made it clear that they wanted state-owned enterprises to be revived. They wanted to make socialism work. So I think there's a lot of delusion, probably caused by people mixing their own feelings up with what the reality is. Sorry, rather long.
Go back to you, Paul. Is China an economic superpower today? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Obviously, it's the second economy in GDP, although it's only about 60% of the United States. I've always said that GDP is about, first of all, disaggregating it across China and seeing how much of China is richer and other parts are poorer, but also looking at the quality of GDP. And for a period in China, about 7 or 8 years ago, there was discussion about having a green GDP in China. That was nixed because it was, they couldn't agree on how to do it. They thought it was a good idea. A green GDP meaning you subtract from the GDP number the bad development, the bridges to nowhere, the pollution, all the stuff. So I think the current, well, you were talking about China's grasp of trying to move up the economic chain. My view is that actually China is, in many respects, maybe 10 to 15 years behind people talking about this in technology. But I think that it's the quality issue, not how many patents you actually have, but how many how many real pieces of innovation. But in my book, I try very hard to find discrete product innovation, and actually, there's not a lot of stuff because it rarely happens in the world, the history of the world. There are very few things which are discrete product innovations. But what China is doing in internet, the Alibabas and Tencents, is true innovation in terms of payments for everything over the internet. There are many areas where China has taken business models and taken them further and advanced them. And I call that the catch-up approach. So I think that China still lags heavily, but it's very hungry to acquire those skills, and there are big gaps in China. One of them is semiconductor. I think people talk about that. I think semiconductor design is a massive gap, and China is out there looking for properties all over America and Europe and the world to buy, so that they can put together a whole semiconductor industry that doesn't rely on foreign design. But I do think that I feel that China is not yet the threat that some people talk about. And in pretty well every sector in the world, you will see at least 2 multinationals, European or American, in control of that marketplace. But will that change? Is it changing? Yes. But I still think that China lags at least 20, 25 years in most areas. Maybe with the exception of defense, where I don't have a lot of insight, but I feel there's a lot more happening that we need to know about.
So, but the one-word answer, China is an economic superpower, not in your view? No, it is not. And you would say?
Well, in my opinion,
First one-word answer.
yeah. In my humble opinion.
Yes, okay, so tell me why.
So one reason is that you want to measure a country's ability to innovate, because that's actually more of a predictor of what their future economic growth is going to be. And I think at this point, for people who have been watching China closely, notice that China's actually crossed the bar from just copycats to actually innovating these days. There are a lot of technological innovations all over China. Most of Silicon Valley's venture capitalists now are actually spending probably even more time in China looking for investments than they are in Silicon Valley. And any artificial intelligence expert is going to say that China and US are probably neck and neck right now in terms of, I guess, research and innovation in that area. And that's just in the private sector. If we look at the public sector, the government sector, and I don't know everything that's going on there, but I would say that just based on various headlines that have come out, that China has actually created vehicles that are hypersonic, meaning that they can reach speeds that are 10 times the speed of sound. They are working on fusion and trying to develop a fusion power that would be up and running within 50 years, which would be so revolutionary that that would mean it would put all other forms of energy out of business. They are the first to implement quantum computing, and this would mean that they would have communications that are completely unhackable, which would also revolutionize our communications across the internet and everywhere else, and satellite communications. And they're working on a quantum computer, which would be 10 million times more powerful than all the world's computers combined today. So when you look at what they're working on these days, and which is really, in some cases, on the bleeding edge, I think that this is going to be sort of a preview of what is going to happen. And so I would say that instead of looking at a snapshot of GDP today, looking at a country's innovative power is actually a better indicator. Another indicator of superpower status obviously is having a reserve currency status, right? And we know that the US right now dominates in that arena. But it's very possible that China could take the lead here as well. They've announced that they're going to have an oil futures exchange based on the renminbi, which means that oil can be purchased using that currency instead of being priced in dollars. This would quickly make their currency much more international. So far they've been using it for mostly trade purposes, but not so much for trading on the financial markets. And so this could be a game changer. And that was actually how the US was able to have a reserve currency, right? Because it used to be based on the gold standard, but when we went off of it, then it was actually tied to oil contracts. Now China's basically replicating that. And so that certainly could also put China into superpower status from an economic standpoint.
So you both disagree on whether China is a superpower, but you're both reasonably optimistic about the performance of the Chinese economy now and in the near-term future. Now, for the last 20 years, there's been a presumption in the West that for China to succeed economically as they become a middle-income country, they would have to politically reform, or they would fall apart. It strikes me that both of you probably disagree with that formulation. If I'm right about that, Why? Why has the West been wrong? Why is it that political reform is unnecessary to allow China to have so many economic successes as they become a more advanced economy? Paul?
Well, if we look at it from the enterprise point of view, the success of the reforms over the last 40 years, in my mind, have been that the party and the government have taken used a relatively light touch in enterprises and taken a backseat, allowing state-owned enterprises to reform and some to flourish, most of them to get themselves into a reasonable shape so they can survive. And that was a very conscious approach by Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues. They said that the government should be taken out of enterprises. And so what happened was the state-owned enterprises were put under a commission, which essentially doesn't have very much industrial experience or very many people. So basically, many of these companies were left to their own devices until occasionally they changed their leadership. But what is happening at the moment, the last 7 years, is that the role of the party in enterprises has been changing quite radically. And I can tell you that in state-owned enterprises in China, there are different degrees of part. In the old days, under Zhu Rongji, there were different levels of party interference or activity. Sometimes during the Three Represents campaign, a state-owned company would hold a meeting under a banner, film it, and send it off. The meeting took 2 minutes. There was no meeting. They sent it off to the party. Done it. Other ones would have a complete office set up to do the Three Represents campaign, and they would have meetings pulling out people who were corrupt. So it depends. It depends on the type of state-owned enterprise. But generally speaking, the party took a very backseat role. I mean, I had to negotiate with lots of party secretaries in China, and they would say to me, I wanted to be implementable, but they didn't tell me what the strategy should be. That was the CEO who was giving me his views. What has happened in the last 5 to 7 years, and it seems to be borne out by the last Congress, is that in the last Congress, if you look at just the attention to party control of industry and listen to state-owned enterprise directors and managers who I have as friends, you will hear very clearly that the party is playing a very, very active role in everything from salaries of even listed entities, Hong Kong listed companies, just saying that you cannot give these bonuses, that you should, to retain good people, or interfering literally in the decision making or the strategy making in the company. And this is actually quite radically different. In China, many people have had a very hard time because they advocated the Constitution as protection against the Communist Party. You may have heard of it. It's called constitutionalism. And they got whacked, right? I've heard people say they want to writing articles about how the company law can be used to protect their company from Chinese, from the government and the parties. And one of the most striking things about the whole reform process was that the Chinese, the powers that be wanted to have companies listed and restructured so they could use other people's money and also create a slightly better run company. But for the managers, the Chinese state-owned managers and directors and CEOs, their whole objective in getting a listing was to detach themselves further from the sphere of influence of the party and the state, to get more autonomy so they can run their companies themselves. So, I do think there has been a massive change, and I think that speaks to the need for some sort of new type of thinking in political governance. And we were asked in the piece here, I think, about should we, what is the Chinese model? And I think we know roughly what it is, which is, you could call it market Leninism, or you could call it, Leninist politics with plus a bit of Confucianism plus market forces. But actually, within China, my experience is that a lot of intellectuals, including some economists in Beijing University, are debating what should China's path be. So just because China has chosen a specific model, it doesn't mean that it wants to perhaps go down the road of Xi Jinping in strengthening the role of the party. And in fact, many of them are very worried about the hubris of the current regime and feels that it has real dangers, because if it succeeds, then China would roll back the reforms to some extent, which would be bad for the economy, I'm sure.
Is that already happening with state-owned enterprises, for an example?
I think we have to determine which ones. There are. What I don't want to come out here sounding very pessimistic, because I'm not. If you look at the positive things are that lots of Chinese companies, whether they're former SOEs or private companies, are brilliant and will be world changers, whether it's in automobility solutions or whether it's in thorium power, we talk about thorium salt, nuclear power. But for some of them, they are certainly feeling a great deal of pressure, which is hampering their ability to be nimble in the world market. They're finding they can't take decisions at this moment. And we thought that the anti-corruption campaign would last for a couple of years. It's lasted for 5 more years now. So this is creating a great deal of confusion and not making the state-owned companies at the highest level unable to really take decisions. So I agree with that.
So what do you think at this point we in the West should take away as lessons from China that could apply here, if anything? I mean, do you believe, given the successes the Chinese economy has presently experienced, do you see anything that if you were advising Washington, any administration, you'd say, actually, that's something you guys should be paying attention to?
Can I answer the other question you asked first?
Sure.
Since I disagree a bit with the idea that it has to reform. Mm-hmm. And the reason why
Paul is saying he doesn't really agree with that.
Right.
I think it may reform. I think it will hold them back. That's all I'm saying.
Fair enough.
Oh.
Got it. But you
I just like playing devil's advocate.
No, it's still fair enough. It's a good point. Go ahead.
And so, so the reason why I say that may not necessarily be the case is because we have to look at China's history, which is very different from ours. And they had spent 2,000 years with emperors running the country, which is very authoritarian. They never had democracy in China. So obviously in 1911, Sun Yat-sen wanted to bring democracy there, and he wanted to import the US Constitution to China, but he never really got to get it off the ground. So China actually never was really exposed to that kind of governance. And therefore, the Chinese people, all they really know is sort of an authoritarian way of governing. And it's worked out quite well for them. And it's not stopped them from innovating. Because if you think about a lot of the early innovations like gunpowder and the compass and all these, and paper and all these things that came out of China, all these inventions were under authoritarian rule. So, so the idea that they have to reform to be more like us is not something that I think is likely to happen. It would take a lot of learning on their part to understand how democracy works, but at this point, it's not clear to me that the Communist Party would like to push that agenda forward, right? Because they think that what they're doing is working perfectly fine.
So now that, for example, now that we're seeing in universities that it's harder to get Western books, for example, has clearly been more crackdown on media organizations and the rest. Is your view that actually not a lot of concern or risk in the Chinese government doing that, if that's their interest?
So I think that the Chinese government will run risk if they try to limit too much discourse in the political arena and other areas. Mostly because if you are in an echo chamber and you have groupthink, then you're going to have blind spots, right? And it's always important to have other points of view in the mix. And so, so the Chinese leadership today has to recognize that and invite those other voices, even if they're going to maintain power as a one-party system. It doesn't mean that they can't have dissenting voices within the party. And so I think it remains too early to tell how this is going to play out with the way that they are becoming, I guess, deploying more surveillance and cracking down more on journalism and limiting, other foreign ideas and so forth. It could just, be sort of a temporary situation where Xi Jinping needs to have more support for his consolidation of power. So it's not clear to me that this is necessarily going to extend forever. Like, hopefully it won't be, but I guess only time will tell.
Good point.
Yes, I would not phrase it about a choice between democracy or not democracy. I'm not telling the Chinese they shouldn't have an autocratic system. I think there are a lot of reasons why China isn't autocratic. I think the government has worried about the people being governable, but also the people themselves are worried about the people being very difficult to govern. So people are prepared to give up some freedoms for a stable society. So I do agree. We don't know where it's going yet. We could give the current government a lot of benefit of the doubt and say that the clampdown, the massive clampdown on civil society is necessary because of all sorts of issues, including rebellious minorities and lawyers who are disrupting the country, whatever. But I think that the choice is not about whether they will embrace liberal democracy. I don't think that that's really where they're heading. As Anne said, the question is, will this new line turn out to be a completely new era, or a new era within socialism with Chinese characteristics? If it's a new era, then it could mean a return to what I would call Liu Shaoqi type communism, not Maoist communism, and Lenin, and even Confucianism. So I'm concerned about that, and that's the concern about a lot of intellectuals in China at the moment. They remember Zhao Ziyang. They remember even fondly Jiang Zemin. Jiang Zemin was was rather pompous sort of person, but they remember him very fondly. And he was the one who said we can bring businessmen into the Communist Party. So they fear there'll be a lot of backsliding, and that is my main concern. I think that there are many examples of ruling Communist parties or parties who have changed gradually over time to become more transparent and more accountable. That's all people probably need at the moment. You look at what happened in Mexico. It took them 80 years to go from a one-party system to a two-party system. So it happens in other countries. I don't want to overstate my pessimism about this, but I think that my concerns are not about the economy. I think that it will, based on past experience and the ability of the party and the government to run things, it will be okay in the next 15 to 20 years. If you want to invest there, things will be tough, but it'll be more of the same. But the political overhang is an anxiety that a lot of people have. And it's not just about, voting, it's about the heavy hand of the state. And so when people ask me about Alibaba, I say, they say, well, should we look at their business model and analyze it before we invest in it? And I said, well, you can do that too, you should. But actually, my real concern is Jack Ma's relationship with the party and the state. Because if that goes out the window, then Alibaba will not be what it was.
So I guess you're pretty aligned in terms of a recognition, understanding that China's economy can continue to succeed with a radically different political model than what we have in the United States. Now, we remember a year ago, Steve Bannon was there in the Trump White House, and his view was the US and China have a zero-sum relationship. That's not going to change. China's only getting bigger. So therefore, we're coming to confrontation. And if that's true, if confrontation is inevitable, much better that we hit them hard now, when we're bigger, than we wait until they're much larger. Do you agree with that? And if so, or if not, why? Yeah.
I think that kind of zero-sum thinking is very dangerous. And that's actually what could lead us into a military conflict if hardliners in Washington continue to think that way. Because the world is not black and white. It's not, I'm right, you're wrong. It's not 0% to 100%. Everything is basically along shades of gray. And there's lots of room for negotiation. There's lots of room for working together on various common issues like climate change. So I think that thinking is actually what I would say if I had to give advice, because you asked me that other question about how would I consult Washington, I would say that they need to actually look at themselves and see how they're actually operating out of fear. And that's not a good place to lead. And we see evidence of this everywhere, right? When we try to control other countries and control the outcomes, that's basically a fear response because we feel unsafe and we feel that we need to make sure we know what the outcome is going to be. And life doesn't work that way, right? There are no guarantees in life. We actually have to basically try to work with people's better natures and try to come up with a better solution. And when people sit down and start brainstorming, I'm sure there are many solutions. It's never, zero sum, we win, they lose. I think that's very limited. And so I think it's actually more psychological when it comes to trying to figure out how the US can get out of its current predicament of sliding backwards.
So, but I certainly agree that, they export, we import, we can work together on the environment. But it was very interesting, I thought, Paul, when you said that, Jack Ma, there's going to be, that there is a fight potentially coming between, sort of how much he can succeed independently from the Chinese government and how much he's going to have to be subservient. That will be seen to a degree in a win versus a loss. And I'm wondering, where aside from that, where do you see the big lines of confrontation coming, even if we want to avoid them?
Right, and I do think it's a very dangerous world. So, on the economic front, you talked a lot about globalization over the years, and I feel globalization has been around for so long. The Romans had it, the British had it, and French had it, and it was essentially these empires were a one-way street. They weren't very fair to the people on the wrong end of the stick. And what happened in globalization is that the people who were supposed to be the victims actually took the initiative and done very well out of it. And I applaud China for joining the WTO and becoming America's factory, the factory of the world. I think that's great. And I think, even though I get a lot of pressure from relatives and friends about globalization, I actually think it's irreversible and actually works quite well. And I think the TPP might have been a good thing for America as well. But I don't see a trade war happening, I mean, a really massive trade war happening very easily. Firstly, because I think China will be very nimble in making concessions or having countermeasures, whether it's on soybeans. And will also, the other huge factor is that the current president's main constituency would be massively hurt by a trade war. You know, if you go to Walmart or anywhere, or IKEA, or any store in America, you will see Chinese goods, and those will become much more expensive. So I think that is a, you know, in that respect, to that extent, the United States is a paper tiger there. But I think what really worries me a lot more is the, well, firstly, I do think that the United States has to look after its own interests. China looks after its own interests, and the United States has to look after its own interests when it comes to a theft of technology, because if you own the semiconductor industry, you can really control how everything works in the world. It's extraordinary. So that, you know, China's push to become, you know, to fill in those technology gaps is really very, very concerted and organized and quite quiet, but happening. And I think the US and CFIUS will, you know, will clamp down more on those things. And I'm not against that. I think each country has to look after itself. But the big overhang, I think, is, you know, is accidental war. You know, I will say here, I think that China cares about its sovereignty and its sovereign interests as it defines it, whether it's Taiwan or Hong Kong. I think that in those places, in Hong Kong, we came very close to the Chinese army taking action. I think very, very close during the Umbrella Revolution. I think we were very, very much closer than we thought. But on Taiwan, I think that as China gets much better capability of hypersonic missiles that can enter and keep the Pacific Fleet away, China will move towards Taiwan and hopefully, from their point of view, hopefully integrate it into China. But it may be through force of arms. And that's a, you know, very dangerous situation, and I'm not sure what will happen. And the same goes with, you know, with Korea, with the South China Sea. I think that's almost over, you know, already, that they already control that. But I think there's risk of accidental war, and I would, you know, I just want people to calm down and not. And I think what is really also most striking is the United States is vacating its role in the world. And it's so obvious that this is happening when you see the two Koreas having their own potential discussions, disregarding the views of the United States on that. Because, you know, the United States is now just watching what's happening. They have no real, we don't know if they have a big role, but it seems like the two Koreas may have some discussion. They may go nowhere, but that's a lot better than getting close to war.
So a couple quick questions. One, do you mean accidental war with Hong Kong, or do you mean the Chinese almost just basically seriously repressed the people of Hong Kong?
I meant accidental war in the international sphere, and Hong Kong is really domestic.
Right.
But the broader point I would make is that I think China cares about its own sovereign interests so much that it would be prepared to kill off the Hong Kong economy, because it's not nearly as important as it was in 1990.
Yeah, it's a tiny piece.
Tiny. But they would, and even the broader economy would, for any major tension building with Taiwan and Korea and the South China Sea, with American, have you ever lived in Hong Kong and traveled to Beijing regularly? Well, regularly, the flights were stopped because of Chinese war games. Just because there were war games going on in Zhejiang.
No, I was just, but I mean,
it would disrupt trade.
The response, I mean, when the Chinese decided that they were not going to tolerate a Hong Kong suffrage, the response of the United States and the UK was to protest diplomatically, and that was about it, right? So it wasn't as if they were really, there wasn't a danger there.
Right. And I lumped it into the same bucket. I think there are the international things like Taiwan, South China Sea, Korea, where there's great potential for conflict between them. if something happened in Hong Kong, I don't think anybody would step in, unfortunately. And I don't think China would do anything too dramatic, but I think things are moving in a very difficult direction. So you know, all the American China specialists are very dismayed these months about the lack of convergence between China and the West. And the same in Hong Kong. There's no convergence between the mainland and China, at least not towards Hong Kong, in the opposite direction. So I think that these are all you know, things that could, if you're looking at the most significant risks that could derail the Chinese economy and the benefits of the reforms, I would say those elements are extremely important and material.
So I want to go back and ask Anne. I think it's always interesting to see how different countries perceive these sorts of challenges. As someone who's covered Russia for a very long time, you know, the Russians going into the American elections and the Russians saying very clearly that the United States has done the same. And I thought the op-ed in the New York Times today, for those of you that read it, was very useful in at least calling a spade on America's historical engagement / intervention, subversion of democratic elections all over the world. Not saying that means what the Russians are doing okay, but nonetheless interesting. So, right? Nonetheless interesting. I say that because of the US-China dynamic on cyber, on stealing intellectual property. We know the Chinese steal intellectual property. It's bad. They shouldn't do that. We want to stop them. On the other hand, we also know that US corporations have had absolutely zero interest in bringing technology to China as opposed to just treating them as a low-end manufacturer and producer. Their interest is in taking the profits out. In fact, it's their fiduciary responsibility to do so, unless the Chinese use the fact that they have no rule of law and no independent judiciary, as well as a fairly aggressive industrial policy, as well as the capacity to steal when they can. And so I wonder, again, I'm not trying to be relativist about it, but I wonder, you said, Anne, everything's a gray zone. Okay, but it could be 90% gray, it could be 80, it could be 60. Give a little impression of how gray you think some of these things are. How sympathetic are you to the Chinese perspective of, we may not admit it, but we need to be stealing this IP. We may not admit it, but we need to be doing this cyber, because if we don't, we never would have been able to get to where we need to be and where the Americans would otherwise never let us get. How sympathetic are you to that?
So I'm not doubting that the Chinese had stolen various trade secrets. However, the way they actually acquired a lot of these technologies actually was through consent of business deals, right? They had negotiated deals with American companies to transfer that technology over so that the American companies would have access to the very large and growing market. And these were agreements that American CEOs readily signed on to. And so not all the technology was stolen. A lot of it was actually transferred legally that way. So I would say that, you know, so I don't know if I would even agree with that characterization of how you asked that question. And I would also, as you were saying, the US is guilty of doing a lot of the things they accuse other countries of doing. So the US is obviously not innocent of never stealing you know, technology secrets from other countries. In fact, we did it plenty, you know, before World War II or after even. We continue to do it still. I mean, if you just Google, you know, all the different lawsuits that go on between corporations with European corporations and US corporations, you'll find that there's plenty of corporate espionage that goes on there as well. So, so the fact of the matter is that it happens everywhere with everyone. And so at this point, I mean, I think that China probably has less need to do it, frankly, given that in the beginning, they didn't have the knowledge, but at this point, they've acquired so much that they probably wouldn't need to do it as much anymore.
Does that mean that you think that the nature of Chinese cyber attacks for industrial purposes against the United States and Europe is actually reducing at this point?
I think they've actually reported that it's gone down somewhat. But actually, most of the cyber attacks that people have traced to China have largely been more about espionage on US intentions from its military standpoint. So I think they cared more about security issues as opposed to corporate issues.
I'm going to let Paul respond to that, but then I'm going to take some questions. So I'm sure some of you have one, and you have one. Oh, no, I'm just going to take some questions. So if you can ask your questions quickly, and if you can respond to them in just a couple sentences.
Do you want me to respond to that one?
What?
Could I just respond
If
to
you're
that
quick,
one?
yeah, because I want to get to some items,
I'm
but go ahead.
I think that the US has been obviously stealing technology ever since the textile revolution. Britain lost, the Americans stole it and brought it over to America. That was the. So I think it's not about being, for or against China or even grey. I think that countries do what they do. Right? So I have personally pulled Chinese engineers off at chemical plants in Pennsylvania where they were trying to measure valves. I've done that, and I would support American companies not wanting to put their core technology into China. But to Anne's very good point, China has done a very good job at catch-up, and I'll give just two quick examples. One is high-speed rail, and of course some of it was stolen, and Kawasaki backed off that lawsuit, but basically China did further innovate high-speed rail, and did a very good job, and now they're working with Bombardier around the world, and the same with Generation 3 nuclear. Westinghouse, which did something it never did in Korea, it gave over, you see in my book, literally tens of thousands of documents, complete everything about Generation 3 technology to help Chinese providers. So get up to speed on that. So, I do, I think that foreign companies are very much complicit in this, but they do hold back key things, that's for sure, and I think they should.
So you're going to work with me here. Short answers, so I can get, and short questions, so I can get at least a few, okay? We're good? Yes. We'll start here, sir, please.
My question is that, as Bremmer pointed out, Chinese are not extremely happy with the 19th Congress reforms. And as far back as 9th of February, there was a coup on Xi Jinping, which the United States was able to stall. And as a payback, the spy Jerry was sent back, drugged to the States. Can you comment on that? And this is not the first coup, this is the third coup. Yeah, I was just saying that the Chinese parties are not happy with the reforms being conducted by Xi Jinping after the 19th Congress. And so there was an attempted coup by the Chinese military on 9th of February this year, which the United States will destroy. So, can you comment on that?
One of you have a comment on that?
Very, very briefly, I think if we were having this conversation,
Use the microphone. Use the mic.
if we were having this conversation 7 years ago, before Bo Xilai, 8 years ago, before Bo Xilai, we might say that China had more or less solved its problem of political succession. I think since we've had Bo Xilai and several other young ones and others, people from the Politburo who've been brought down, you can see there is a lot of factionalism in the Chinese Communist Party, which is not healthy. And Xi Jinping's dealing with that in his own way. And so I think that I have no knowledge of all these things that are going on, but overall, I think the Chinese intellectuals and the people are broadly behind the party in a general sense, but are trying to argue a case for less state involvement.
Sir.
So, just to get things back to maybe where they began, the title of this talk is, Will the Chinese Way Win the Future? And from the discussion you three have been having over the last 40 minutes or whatever, it doesn't sound to me like anybody's way will win the future. It sounds like, you've all written books, right? So, chapter 1 starts on page 1 and ends on page 20. That chapter is 20 pages long. If chapter 2 starts on page 21 and goes to page 41, you might subtract 41 from 21 and say, okay, that chapter is 20 pages too, but actually you have what's called in mathematics an off by 1 error. Because 20 minus 1 is 19, but it's actually a 20 page. That's a little, so China has a one-party state.
Let's leave that analogy.
China has a one-party state and no free press, and the U.S. has a plutocracy that happens to have 2 parties. So, it doesn't sound to me like anybody's way is going to win the future. So wouldn't it be more productive to try to come up with an idea that maybe no one's ever thought of before? I don't want to make things too difficult on the 3 of you. That would win the future. That wouldn't take, that wouldn't run these scenarios as like, oh, are we all going to go to war? Is, this horrible thing going to happen? Or is this, what would be something that could just uplift? I don't want to sound too, world peace from this congeniality, but wouldn't it be better to try to think of something that would win the future instead of just all these crappy incarnations of things?
I'm going to answer this. No, because you're absolutely right. That I think in the conversation we've had here, I think that despite the fact there's optimism about China, there's not a lot of view that China's going to win the global model. Now, I think that
I don't think China wants to.
No.
So,
right. That was the title of the talk.
I understand. We didn't title the talk. No, look, I think that you have, number one, if you agree with Putin and Elon Musk that whoever wins AI wins the planet.
No.
But if one does, then you would make a bet on the U.S. or China, and it is not clear which way you would make that bet. But barring that, it seems to me that it's much more likely that present systems of governance are going to change radically over the next 20, 50 years. Large-scale central governments seem to me not necessarily a thing of the past, but they're going to have to coexist much more with cities if we have much more structural inequality in growth and uninclusive growth, and first-tier cities are going to be much more important. You're going to have much more decentralization, also have much more corporates and other non-state actors that become more important. So I think governance is going to become much more messy. And so in that regard, I think it's, if you want to do a 2040, 2050, it's wonderful to say that China's not going to fall apart. I don't think we think it is. It's wonderful to say the U.S. is not going to fall apart. Very few people think it is. But it's much harder to make a strong bet that one of those two is going to be the dominant model in 30 or 40 years. And the exciting thing about living in this environment is that people don't actually know what the next model is going to be, which is very different from living over the course of the last 50-ish years. I'm not going to answer any other questions, but that was kind of fun. But here, we're going to go, you had one, and then you have one. I'm going to try to get both, at least both of yours, and Anne gets the next one. Yeah, go ahead.
I think we should talk about One Belt, One Road initiative a little bit, because it's going to shape China's future in many ways. A lot of people think that is more aggressive than the Marshall Plan. I think, so I'm kind of curious to hear your opinion on this. Do you think the initiative is something that China poses as a threat to the Western world, or an opportunity for the Western world to participate, especially in the private sector? Because I have already seen a lot of opportunities where the private sector can participate. So yeah, just wanted to hear your opinion on this.
So like with anything, you can have different opinions about the same thing. So the One Belt, One Road is case in point. Some people see opportunity and other people see it as a threat. it's already been announced that the US is going to team up with India and Australia and Japan to have a counter to the One Belt One Road because they see it as a threat. And so if you look at it from a geopolitical standpoint, they will see that because that Eurasian bridge that China is building would actually also help connect Russia more closely to various states in the Middle East and to Europe. And so the US looking at that and say, oh, this is not good. If we sit back, Iran and Russia might have greater influence over our allies than Europe. So it depends on who you ask and what lens you bring to a set of facts. And so, but from a business standpoint, I'm sure lots of people would see lots of opportunity with this, right? So it really depends on how you look at it.
Last question. Go back there.
In building up this sort of dichotomy between the United States system and the Chinese system, what is the Chinese system's primary competitive advantage? We focus a lot on why the Chinese system might fail. We focus a lot on why the United States system might cede space for China. But what about the Chinese system makes it uniquely good compared to the United States?
Good closing question for both of you.
It's very good. I think one of the distinguishing factors...
Microphone.
One of the distinguishing factors of China is its massive domestic market, where they can prototype things and get scale very quickly. And I think, China only 52% of the country is urbanized at this stage. It's going to go to 70% according to the plan, and that means vast waves of development and growth, but also with that innovation too, in terms of new mobility solutions, whatever it is, replacement for cars in cities. So I think the second thing would be industrial policy, but I have to say I've seen the effect of industrial policy tapering off in some areas. It was very influential in China's first handsets. They were completely sponsored by the government, if you like. But when it came to the smartphone, that was done by a company like Huawei on their own, more so. But I think that the industrial policy is there and is very, very strong. And one of the things that I've observed is that when you talk about a Huawei and a ZTE, these are two companies. One, ZTE was originally a state-owned company, and Huawei is a private company with links to the government. So but they have independent strategies and work fiercely to create their own customer bases, etc., etc. And people then surmise that there is nothing behind that. There is government policy. I can't prove it. I can't tell you exactly who the people are. But behind all those, there are these Lingdao-Xiaozu. There are the leading groups in the party and the state who are watching over, routers and switches, artificial intelligence, and whether the independent company doing it, the policy makers above it are very well coordinated, and I think China is excellent at that. And of course, the negative things we mentioned, which are like rule of law and things like that.
So you get the last statement?
I actually think China's non-ideological approach is their competitive advantage because they basically have been saying and practicing non-interference with a lot of countries. They don't try to push their way of doing things or their view of the world on other countries to give them assistance. And I think that is actually what allowed China to grow so rapidly in their trade relationships around the world. And because people don't want to be pushed around, they don't want to be bullied. And that's actually something that has worked to China's advantage. And so, China doesn't have the military strength anywhere close to what the US has. It doesn't have the security alliances that the US has, but China happens to have a lot of friends in the UN. It has a lot of folks who are willing to work with it, on various initiatives, whether it's One Belt, One Road or the AIIB. So I think that is actually a competitive advantage that many Americans probably would not want to admit.
Now, is that going to change real soon? I mean, if you're Vietnam, you probably wouldn't agree with that, right? I mean, is is that purely like the fact that China is comparatively small still and doesn't project military power globally, as opposed to the fact it's not ideological, and as it grows, more countries around the world will think about China the way Vietnam presently does?
India.
So that's different from ideology, though.
Right.
Right, so that's just power politics, perhaps. So, and so I would make that distinction. China's not trying to create color revolutions and say, oh, you must be communist before we work with you. Right,
So the America First policy will be more effective internationally in that regard?
There is ideology.
Because it's more Chinese, right? I mean, if Trump is basically abdicating on human rights and sort of pro-democracy and the rest, that would be a comparative positive. I think we can end on that. There we go. Thank you all, guys.